And I had one cousin who even would put a maid's uniform in the back to make sure she would pass. At one time, my mother and her sister went to the Five and Dime to get peanuts. Now, they put my mother's peanuts in the white wax lined bag, but they put her sister's in a plain brown bag that showed the oil coming all the way through. Her sister was sort of brown skinned, and it was a big difference in them. One night after dinner, after watching the news, we would go out on the front porch and sit. On this one occasion, a group of white boys kept passing the house, and they would shine a bright light in our faces. And my father said, just sit there, just ignore me or go away. But not Helen. Helen's going to always push the envelope. What did she do? Well, my father had guns in different parts of the house, and even had a machine gun, and we don't know and didn't ask where that came from. It got there and it disappeared the same way, I guess. But Helen went in the house and got one of my father's guns and sort of stood behind him, and she swore that if they came back again, she was going to shoot. Sure enough, they came back, and she took aim. And just when she was pulling the trigger, my father hit her hand and deflected the bullet in the ground and told her, don't you know if you had hurt any of them, it would have been very little I could do to get you out of jail. Now, Helen was always, like I said, pushing the envelope. We went to the store one time, the department store. They had the white water fountain and the black water fountain. Well, the white water fountain was porcelain, white, pretty clean and everything. The white water fountain was about 3 feet away, water dripping, metal barely working. So Helen decided she was going to go in and test the water. And I was supposed to be the lookout person. I didn't look out fast enough because she had just taken a couple of gulps, and this white man came and grabbed her by the collar and told her, don't you know better than that? And so my mother was really angry with Helen, and when she got home, she got an old Southern whipping. Helen still pushing the envelope. We were on the bus. And on the bus, whites could sit in the front of the bus and blacks in the back. And there was a board there saying white section only. Well, we got on the bus and it was a lot of empty white seats. The blacks were all standing up in the back. My mother and I went on in the back. What did Helen do? She moved the sign and said, come on, Mama, we can sit down. Well, the bus driver stopped the bus. We got off. Helen was scolded. She got another Southern whipping. She got a lot of those. I was a good kid. I don't know. Now, when my father would go to work, he was always dressed from head to tail. I should say from head to toe. And just seeing him dress, the suits he wore, but before he would put on his coat, this was his shoulder holster that he wore every day, everywhere he went. He had that along with his gun. One day, he got a call from the Klan saying, we're going to be waiting for you when you leave your office. My father said, I leave at 5 o'clock every day. Take your best shot. Nothing happened. My father would go to the office and leave the office like clockwork. He left at 5 o'clock. He was home by 5:30, and we had dinner shortly after that. As I mentioned, my father always had time for us. We would go to the movies every Saturday evening. If he had been out of town flying in, he made sure he got in time to take us to the movie. Now, Helen was a big cowgirl person. And again, you all are probably too young to remember this, but they had a series that you would see one part of the show, and then next week you would see the other. Well, Hopalong Cassidy was one of the people, Roy Rogers, and the Durango Kid. and we did not miss seeing those. We would go to the movies, and then coming home, we would stop by the neighborhood drugstore and get ice cream. And then it was a man on the corner selling hot peanuts, and we would get peanuts for my mother. We did that quite a bit. Even when we went to college, my father would write a letter Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Friday, mail it on Saturday, and we got a special delivery letter every week, every Sunday we were in school. Helen got a letter every week when she was at Fisk. I got a letter every week when I was at Talladega. That happened every year. Helen was really tired of things happening that she was restricted in doing. So when she finished Fisk, she had a friend who said, come on to California with me. So she went to California, and she thought she had arrived in heaven. And she said the races seemed to get along well, and she said, I won't come back to Birmingham. Well, I was trying to date, and my boyfriend and I wanted to go out, but we couldn't go without a chaperone, and Helen was home, and my friend's uncle was home. So we introduced them. So they got married, didn't stay in Birmingham. They moved to California, and she stayed there for many years before moving back. In 1962, George Wallace was elected governor, and he was elected governor, and his message was segregation now, segregation forever. And most people consider that he was a big segregationist, but my father said that when he was a judge, my father had a case before him, and there was no place for him to eat. And he said that Wallace invited him back into his chambers and ordered food for him, and they sat and talked. So they really felt that he was saying he was such a segregationist to be elected. In '62, there were a lot of demonstrations going in all across the South and Southeast, and Birmingham was no different. Going downtown, you had a lot of the community people going in to demonstrate. They were getting sort of fewer people because once the whites found out that they were demonstrating, they could lose their jobs. Excuse me. So what happened, the students from Miles College started sitting in for the demonstrations, and many of them were arrested. But they did take a leadership role in doing so. In 1963, we had selective buying, and this was going on during the Easter holiday because blacks were really into fashions, the hats, the shoes matching, purses matching. And we would spend a lot of money downtown buying Easter clothes for not only ourselves, but for the kids too. This selective buying went on, and they were hoping that the merchants would try to hire salespeople, integrate the water fountains and lunch counters, but it did very little good. And it was just about at this time when Shuttlesworth asked King to come down to Birmingham, which he did. April 3rd, King came down, and he was eventually jailed. While he was in jail, he was writing the famous letter from the Birmingham jail, which my father and other attorneys would bring out and put pieces together to be printed. Now the spring demonstration started to collapse because they didn't have enough volunteers to go down and sit and everything. Because again, people were afraid of losing their jobs, and it really just wasn't enough students to continue. So one of the aides thought about using the children. Now King and Malcolm X and a lot of the other leaders were against doing that, but King finally gave in. What they did was to send out flyers to all of the schools, and they really got a lot of the athletes, star athletes, to really sort of talk it up. They were told, they came to a mass meeting, and King told them that they would probably be arrested, but he wanted everything to be non-violent. So on May 2nd and 3rd, the children marched. They kept coming. But while they were trying to get out of school, the teachers would block the door, the principals would lock the front doors, and the kids would beat it to the back door and side doors to get out. Some even jumped out of windows to go. but the children were orderly in marching and singing freedom songs. Now, we had a terrible person by the name of Eugene Bull Connor, and he was the commissioner over safety, which meant he was over the police department and the fire department. And he ordered the police dogs, which were vicious, and he ordered the fire people to put the fire hose at maximum level. And what happened, kids were knocked down off their feet, they were rolling down the street, it knocked clothes off of kids, knocked the bark off the tree, it was really bad. But they kept coming. They filled up the jails, and then they decided to put them in the horse and pig pens at Alabama State Park. My mother had a friend whose daughter had been arrested, and she took her little Samsonite overnight bag to the jail where she had packed her daughter's house shoes, pajamas, rollers, deodorant, toothbrush, and toothpaste. And when she got there, the jailer said, "Where you think you're going with that? Your daughter's in jail. She can't have any of that." So things like that happen. I had an aunt who was looking for a son, and she knew that he had probably been arrested. So she was watching the 6 o'clock news, and who did she see but Walter Horace waving as he was getting into the paddy wagon. So she knew where he was. On May 10th, A.G. Gadsden's motel was bombed. And this was where King had a lot of his meetings and everything. And that was sort of the beginning of the bombings in '63. June the 11th, 1963, Fred Gray and my father were the attorneys for Vivian Malone and James Hood as they made their journey to the University of Alabama. And this was when Wallace made his famous stand in the schoolhouse door. The students were admitted, and my father really let his guard down because he said, well, if anything was going to happen, it would have happened. But he was wrong. He was dead wrong. Now, over the years, my father had been fighting civil rights from the 30s on up, and he had so many threats from the Klan. He had been the attorneys for King, Shuttlesworth, the demonstrators, some of the children, and just people in general. But he was beginning to sort of reduce his practice. He was getting older, and he said it's time for the younger attorneys to take over, which they did. In Birmingham, young lawyers had started fighting for the desegregation of the Birmingham schools. On August 19th, one day before the Klan bombed our house, the federal judge had approved the desegregation plan from the Board of Education. And the plan was to allow 5 black students to be admitted to 3 all-white elementary schools and high schools. And the Klan thought that my father was the attorney. So on August 20th, we had our first bombing. My mother and I had gone to the movies to watch whatever happened to Baby Jane. Never found out what happened. But we were at the movies, and halfway through, a neighbor came and tapped us on the shoulder and said, "You all need to come home. Something has happened." So when we were in the car, he said, "The house had been bombed, and I'm taking you home." As we approached Center Street, 8th Avenue and Center Street, you cannot imagine the number of people. If you can imagine going to a football game, seeing thousands and thousands of people all crowded in the streets. It was something I'd never witnessed before. It was frightening. Blacks were throwing bottles and bricks. Police were shooting up in the air, and we had 3 blocks. We could not drive. The police cursed us out and said we couldn't drive that car anywhere, and we had to walk those 3 blocks. Well, my mother was beginning to get asthma, and we didn't know if we were going to make it up there for her to get a treatment or not. The crowds were just everywhere. They were throwing bricks. It was terrible. And the damage to the house when we got there, every window had been blown out, not only at our house, but all the houses in the block. The garage doors had been blown open. My mother had a convertible. It was crushed. And like I said, every window was blown out. When we got there, I saw that my father was okay. And I immediately started running in the back because I love dogs. I had 2 dogs. And when I got to the back, Mr. Lay from the Civil Defense was covering my dog. I'm sorry. This happens sometimes. Sorry. And it was bits and pieces of tassel over the yard. Now, in the house, the FBI said that had anybody been there, the pressure of the bomb would have killed them. If not, where we had the large picture window, and where it ripped through the walls, it would have been like a machine gun going through the person's body. So my father said, well, they've done it. They're not going to do it anymore. So he let his guard down again. The second bombing took place on September the 4th. The paper had written that nobody was hurt because they were in the other part of the house. My father was in the other part of the house. So what they did was to plant the bomb at the other end of the house. This time we were all there. My mother was in bed, my father was in the living room, and I was in the kitchen making a ham sandwich. You can just remember that so vividly. I just put the mayo on the bread, when all at once, this big explosion blew out all the windows. But I knew the routine, to hit the floor and crawl to safety. Got to my father and saw that he was okay, and I went to see how my mother was, and she had been knocked unconscious, out of bed and everything. Again, the crowds came from everywhere. We had a neighbor across the street who was a friend to my sister, who lived right across the street. And when he heard the bombing, he came out. And when he got to his front porch, the police were already in his driveway. The police had blocked off all parts of the streets. And they told Houston to go back inside. They were going to shoot him if he left his porch. And he said, well, you'll just have to shoot me. And he came on across the street. And he and my father were trying to open the door. Again, it was a crowd of people. Houston's family's house had been damaged in the bombing, and they were having it repaired. And they had a big pile of bricks where the house was being shored up again. Not one brick was left with all of the melee that was going on. Again, we received good and bad mail. Some people were saying, come visit us. Some were very hateful letters. Got a call from Robert Kennedy, who asked how things were going. And my father talked to him at length. September 15th, 16th Street Church was bombed. And I knew 3 of the kids, and my mother knew all of the parents. Now this bombing marked the turning point for the civil rights movement, and became a catalyst of change for Alabama and for America. And a few years later, on March 21st, 1965, during the march from Selma to Montgomery, bombs were planted again around Birmingham. One was planted at A.G. Gaston's motel. One was planted behind a local high school here in Birmingham. One was planted at the Catholic Church 1 block from the house. And we felt like they made a mistake putting it there because our church across the street from the house used to have a lot of interracial meetings, and one was planted at our house. Well, my father went across the street to see if it was one at our church, and he didn't find one, so my mother had gone down to the end of the property, and she found the bomb. I was in college, and when I came in from wherever I was coming from, it was like I was walking and the kids just sort of parted. And I said, it's my slip hand, what's going on? And they said, Barbara, turn on the TV. And that's where I was hearing where they were finding all the bombs. I immediately went to the telephone trying to call it to see what was going on, if my family was okay. Could not reach anybody. I took my phone book and just went down to call people. But I didn't know they had evacuated several blocks because they said had the bomb gone off at our house and the Catholic Church, it would have leveled a couple of blocks. Now, I've mentioned to you the early beginnings of my father and also the personal experiences. But my father did have some good things that happened. He ran again for state legislature in '64, lost again. In '68, my father was appointed to the city council to fill an unexpired, well, it is an expired person who had died. And then later on, he ran and won for the seat. In '68, he was the first black elected delegate to go to the National Democratic Convention, and again in 1972. In the '80s, he closed his practice. And in 1996, he died at the age of 92 at home. Now, where are we now? I think we all know that racism is alive and thriving, and we see it every day. I found a group of my father's old speeches, and I was going over the speeches. And what he was speaking on 40, 30, 50 years ago, you could take that speech and use that same speech today. We've come a long way. But again, I found that it's impossible to embrace the future if you don't know where you've come from. The American dream has not been fully realized. It's not enough to open the gates of opportunity. All of us must have the ability to walk through those gates. Our task over the years has been to see that not only African Americans, but all minorities have the same chance as every other American to learn, grow, and share in society to develop our abilities and to pursue our individual happiness. I'm really sure that if my father and Martin Luther King were here, they would be really saddened that all of what they fought for in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, we're fighting them right again. It's not a good feeling. For the great majority of African Americans and other minorities, the poor, the unemployed, the homeless, and despite the legal victories, racism still exists. It's a cancer in the heart of those who have prejudice and those who discriminate, and it violates the most basic human American values of justice and opportunity. Now, as I leave here today, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Are you willing to take an active stand against racism where you see it exists? Or will you merely become a spectator and return to the safety of your offices, your schools, and your neighborhoods to the comfort of your home? Are you willing to stand up for what is right in the face of opposition? Are you willing to reach out and help someone in need? Are you willing to work passionately at making a difference? If you can answer yes to these questions, then in the words of Frederick Douglass, you're the kind of person who can change the world. And I'm also reminded of Michael Jackson, A Man in the Mirror, and I gave you all a mirror. And I'd like to paraphrase. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking you to change your ways and make no message, and no message could be any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and then make a change. I'm going to make a change for once in my life. It's going to feel real good. I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to make it right. I challenge all of you to use your energy in advocating the cause of freedom, justice, equality, hope, and opportunity. And perhaps in years to come, you can help write the next chapter in American history of freedom and equality to all. I want to thank you all for not going to sleep on me after lunch. And I wanted to just ask you something. In your little packet, see if any of you all have a red dot. It should be like that. Oh, I do. Okay, I have a gift for you. Oh. autographed copy of the book.
Oh, thank you.
Again, thank you for having me. Be blessed and walk in peace. Thank you.
Barbara, will you entertain questions?
Okay.
Are there any questions or comments anybody would like to make?
I have a question. Would you each be able to share with us what's on the display up there?
Okay. This is a scrapbook that my father started. It shows when he was first past the bar, and it just has news clippings throughout his career. And he had them all in a little briefcase, all crumbled up together. And when I was in graduate school, I took it up to Illinois and had them laminated and put on, bound and everything. And I recently donated the originals to the Alabama Archives, State Alabama Archives, and told them I would do it, but they would have to give me 2 copies, one for each of my children, which they did. But you're more than happy to browse through the scrapbook.
Yeah.
And the other is your...
It's just telling about the book, The Gentle Giant of Dynamite Hill.
Did you bring any?
They are out of print, and I have ordered some more to be printed. But it takes 3 months to get them printed. So you got the last book. Yes, ma'am.
Sure. Did your neighborhood sort of come together? You mentioned about the people inside the home, outside the home. Were they the, I guess, black people?
They were the neighbors.
Neighbors?
Mm-hmm. They formed a committee where they were guarding the house. And while the men were guarding the house, you had the women from different churches bringing the best fried chicken and ham sandwiches to give to them and coffee to keep them awake and everything. And they would have certain hours that they would come, and when they would leave, somebody else would come. And they had walkie-talkies where they could tell what was going on.
The civil defense unit that Barbara's talking about really and truly operated in the community. I met a young man who was a young man, a teenager then, talked about that in that neighborhood, but they really did. They just got together as a community, formed a civil defense unit, and they guarded the neighborhood. Jen, you had a question or comment?
Yes. First, thank you so much for sharing with us and being with us. You, in the packet that you gave us, you have a copy of the chief of police letter that you referenced.
Right.
Besides this, can you speak to these allegations against your father of being a communist activities, and how that played out for he and your family?
Right. It was a man by the name of Glenn Taylor, who was sympathetic towards the Communist Party, came to Birmingham to speak. What happened, he went in through the door for colored only, and he was arrested. And my father represented him. Also, there's another white attorney by the name of Crampston, or I can't think of his exact name, who also represented communists in the party. And my father knew him. In fact, he was one of the attorneys who got my father out of jail when they were arrested the first time. But my father had no communist ties at all. Not at all. Like I said, everything was so untrue in the letter and everything. But that's how I think that came about. Yes, ma'am.
Follow up to that, can you tell us how you ended up with that letter, or if your father had a full FBI record that you ever got?
I don't know. My father started collecting letters, and sometimes people would mail him certain things. I have 2 volumes of letters that he collected from the 30s on up to the 70s and 80s, and this was just one of the letters, but I don't know how he got that copy. Yes, sir.
When Dr. King began the nonviolent movement struggle, did do you know there was much of a conflict in your neighborhood between the ideas of nonviolence and obviously your father and others having to protect themselves with guns in the neighborhood and everything else? Was there any sort of conflict or any sort of discussion on any of this, or?
Not to my knowledge. I know with the march and everything, King talked about nonviolence. My father was a very quiet and soft-spoken man. But he wanted, I think, to protect the family. He never used the gun at all. So I don't know if it was a real conflict or not, except in the marching and that philosophy of King. Because other people in the community, everybody had guns. Especially living in that area, you just didn't know what was going to happen. Yes, sir.
Did your father or your parents, did they ever encourage you and your sister to get involved in the marches and demonstrations and anything like that? Or discourage you?
No, not at all. I was away in school in the 60s when all of that was going on. And Helen had basically in 62 already moved to California. So we missed out on that. But again, he would write letters and tell us what was going on. And when I was at Talladega, they had demonstrations like the year before I got there. And Helen, like I said, she had moved away. Yes, ma'am.
Did your sister's opinions of California as a place to leave the racism of the South ever change?
Yes, and let me tell you that story. They would send their children to Birmingham to be with their grandparents. And so they would usually drive to Birmingham all the time, twice a year. And her husband said he was getting tired of driving every year, they should just move. And he had picked out a lot and all of that, and Helen didn't believe that he was going to move until the moving van came to the house. And she had to move down with him. She was not happy in doing that. She wanted to stay, but it was either move down to Birmingham or be in California by herself. And like I said, Helen would always sort of push the envelope, but she did come down. She was still sort of angry when she moved here. She was a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. But she decided at age 40 she was going to go to law school. So she went to law school, and I think her attitude started to change then. And then later she was appointed the first African-American circuit judge in Jefferson County. And she was happy she was here. But it took some time. They went to California for years before they moved back.